on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the country. Welcome back. He's still in the country. Welcome back.
I only wish.
Welcome back to the show. Author, historian Rick Perlstein, here to talk about his latest, Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980.
Sam,
Rick,
I tried. I really tried, but they wouldn't let me in any other country.
I bet you.
I would have to quarantine for 2 weeks.
There you go.
Bad idea.
Well, now, all right. First off, we should just say this is the fourth, and I hope what is an ongoing series of books, but it's your life. But Before the Storm, that was the rise of Barry Goldwater, Nixonland, and then The Invisible Bridge, which were sort of like the Nixon era and into sort of the ascendance of Reagan, maybe pre-Reaganland, and then Reaganland, which, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I got lost there for a second. And Reaganland, which oddly enough starts in 1976 as opposed to 1980, right? I mean, his Reaganland started before he actually even became president. But I want to start here, because the thing about this iteration, or I should say, I don't want to say chapter, but this episode of this history that you are recounting, is that like I was a teenager or getting close to there. And so some of this stuff like I was aware of peripherally. And so it was really, it's fascinating for me. But I want to start with this, Pat Caddell, because you start with Pat Caddell, and I had forgotten about Pat Caddell, but I had dealt with Pat Caddell sort of, 10, 15 years ago, quite a bit. Tell everybody who Pat Caddell was. And in many respects, he had an awareness of what made much of our modern politics.
Absolutely. So Patrick Caddell, to put it most bluntly, he was a pollster and a political strategist. But it's much more than that. I'll even start from the beginning. It's 1968. There's this high school kid named Pat Caddell. He's really interested in John F. Kennedy, and he's really interested in baseball statistics. He grew up in Massachusetts, then his family moved to the panhandle of Florida, which is basically George Wallace country. And in 1968, he's supposed to do a project for math class, and he decides to poll his neighbors about who they want for president. And this, I guess, is kind of like early in 1968. And all his kind of cracker neighbors in northern Florida say that they either want George Wallace, the racist governor of Alabama, or RFK, the liberal Robert F. Kennedy, the liberal senator from New York, who went nose to nose with George Wallace in 1963 over school segregation. And this high school kid, Pat Caddell, says, what the heck is going on here? Why do the same people want this right-wing demagogue and this liberal for president? And he realizes that he has the insight that animates his political life and really in a lot of ways our political lives as well. He realizes that people don't really vote on issues. They don't study, what one politician wants to pass in terms of policy as opposed to the other. They vote when it comes to feelings. And the feeling they got from RFK and Wallace was that both guys were tough. They were going to kick the establishment's butt. And he goes to Harvard for college, and he starts a polling company, literally from his dorm room. He is hired as one of George McGovern's pollsters when he's still in college. And another guy he has as a client is this young 29-year-old kid who's running for Senate from Delaware named Joe Biden. And what he tells Joe Biden is that people are so mad at Washington. They have these angry feelings towards Washington that he shouldn't even mention the name of his opponent, or at least he should avoid mentioning the name of his opponent. He should just say he's running against Washington. And of course, we know what happened with young Joe Biden. He wins his Senate race. 4 years later, he's Jimmy Carter's pollster. And it's the Florida primary, a very important primary. And Jimmy Carter is in a showdown against George Wallace. George Wallace is running for president for the third time. And his slogan is basically trolling. He says, send them a message, right? He's saying, to all these Southern, reactionary guys in pickup trucks, let's really stick it to them libs by giving a really strong showing for me. And Jimmy Carter comes back, and Pat Caddell comes up with an even better slogan. This time, don't send them a message, send them a president. We'll even troll them harder. And Jimmy Carter wins that primary. And one result of that is that all these liberals in places like New York decide that Jimmy Carter is the liberal great hope because he can defeat all these right-wing populist reactionaries. He can reach the deplorables. And that's an enormous step in Jimmy Carter's rise to the presidency. And it's completely based on this insight that people vote on these like visceral feelings they have about candidates. And fast forward, another 20 years, and Pat Caddell is a big supporter of Donald J. Trump. He just died, by the way, so I don't have to worry about him libeling me.
Okay, well, there we go. Good. We can crap.
I can libel him. I mean,
exactly.
I'm not going to libel him.
We can.
He's not going to sue me.
We can crap all over Pat Caddell because he was one of the original sort of like a Fox Democrats, if you will. Right. I guess back in the day. But what also struck me too, just was that occasionally you would hear that like, I'm voting either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. What?
Right. Same deal.
And it's sort of a similar dynamic. And I'm sort of that insight, as much as like just the idea of Pat Caddell just bums me out. But that insight is it's fascinating in terms of of this whole epoch that you cover, because the interplay between sort of material concerns and non-material concerns, or material concerns based upon sort of like cultural grievance. I mean, all of these things, it's sort of fascinating. And so segueing into basically what you're talking about is there's three elements of the growth of... Let me actually
go ahead. Quickly interrupt you, because this gets to the con job part of it, right? So when Jimmy Carter becomes president, Pat Caddell forms his own private polling firm, and he's advising Jimmy Carter at the same time as he's polling for private clients like the government of Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
You're speechless.
Yeah, well,
Continue.
There you go. I mean, that sounds like Pat Caddell in a way, to a certain extent. But okay, so you're when we talk about the rise of Reagan, there are three sort of broad elements that you cite: the new right, the sort of the migration of evangelicals into the public sphere, leave unto Caesar no more, I guess.
Right.
And then what you call the class consciousness of business interests awaken. And I think you called them the boardroom Jacobins. So
that's right.
Which one of those of that troika makes sense to start with first?
We can start with the new right and the evangelicals, because they work together and eventually fuse with the boardroom Jacobins. So we can roll up the whole 900 pages in a few quick sentences.
Great.
So basically, Jimmy Carter is the first person that evangelicals retreat from their tradition of not getting involved in partisan politics. There's a line in Thessalonians, keep your eyes on things above and not things of this world, right? So a lot of preachers, even if they're super conservative, they don't really get themselves involved with, telling their flocks who to vote for, except, with the exception of John F. Kennedy, because he's supporting the whore of Babylon and is going to help turn over the country to the Vatican.
Right.
But we'll just leave aside that complexity. And you have these guys who basically are coming out of the Goldwater campaign, are traumatized by Goldwater's huge loss in 1964, and fast forward 10 years later, and they're all these conservative strategists. They call themselves the New Right, and they basically come up with the idea that the reason that Barry Goldwater lost was that he was much too explicit about the actual agenda, the economic and policy agenda of a conservative president, doing things like making Social Security voluntary and thus destroying it, privatizing the TVA and turning over this amazing public resource that gave rural South electricity for the first time, and turning it over to business. All this, ending agricultural subsidies. They realized that they can do a much better job of electing conservative politicians if they respond to people's actual terror about how the social changes of the 1960s are being institutionalized and how people are enjoying more sexual freedom, women are enjoying more independence. And they do things like they scan the horizon for things that are just pissing people off in rural America. Like, for example, the fact that the school board in Charleston, West Virginia, has adopted multicultural textbooks. And that was in 1974. I write about it in my last book. And it gets these people in the rural hollers so mad that they start a movement that ends up with the dynamiting of the school board. And what the New Right does is they have a new think tank called the Heritage Foundation, and they send lawyers to Charleston, to West Virginia, to represent the guys who are dynamiting the school building, and by the way, hooking them up with all these other anti-textbook crusaders all over the country. So they do that with the ERA, they do that with gay rights, and what they call that is organizing discontent.
That's Howard Phillips, right? Is one of those, is I think that was his sort of quote, Phillips.
Yeah, Howard Phillips says, we organize discontent. Another one of these guys is a guy named Paul Weyrich. Both of them, by the way, become theocrats who argue that the Bible should be the basis for civil law by the 1980s and 1990s. And Paul Weyrich says, sex is the Achilles heel of the liberal Democrats. In other words, people like their Social Security, people like their Medicare, but if we can just reach them through their rage at the Democrats' commitment to sexual equality, and abortion, then we can win them for the Republican Party. We can win them for conservatism. Now, that's kind of part one of this coalition. The leader of these guys is a guy named Richard Viguerie. They call him the Godfather of the New Right. And his specialty is basically the kind of manipulation of Facebook that we see by kind of Russia and the far right in 2016. But he does it with something called direct mail. He sends these terrifying letters to millions of people who, whose names appear on mailing lists because they once gave to a conservative politician, or they subscribed to a conservative magazine, or whatever. He has millions of names, and he sends out these terrifying letters saying the liberals want to force homosexuals to teach your children homosexuality. Send $10 to make this stop, and we'll try and elect this politician. Right? He gets rich off this, and it's going pretty well. But one of the things he realizes very early, kind of in the middle of the 1970s, is the best possible way to weaponize this strategy is to win over all these right-wing conservative fundamentalist preachers who have abstained from politics for so many years. And if he does that, he basically can't lose, because he'll have these automatic free sync organizations. So basically have the equivalent of the union movement for the right. And so a big part of the book is how he recruits people like Jerry Falwell to form this organization, the Moral Majority, right? And how, kind of stations across along the way are these attempts to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment, which, give him more names for his mailing list, attempts to, support things like the Hyde Amendment, absolutely savage, nasty, awful backlash movements against gay rights, in which you find preachers, basically unfurling this QAnon-like theory that gay men are recruiting children and murdering them, right? It's absolutely ugly stuff. But, long story short, it succeeds. Jerry Falwell becomes one of the most important backers of Ronald Reagan. So then you get in kind of stool three of the Reagan coalition. And that's not just kind of small businessmen, but the kind of Fortune 500 CEOs who, during the golden years of capitalism after World War II in the 50s and the 60s, who are making money hand over fist, completely accept the idea of the liberal state as equal partners in the economy of the United States. They accept regulation as cost of doing business. They make their peace with unions. They call it the Labor Management Accord.
Right.
They call it the liberal consensus, right? And what happens is after the Arab oil embargo of 1973, when profits start declining because people don't realize that all this prosperity is based on the existence of cheap energy,
Right.
which actually the price actually goes down in real dollars since World War II. And no one even really thinks about this as something that could, go away. Part of the way they deal with that trauma to their business model is that they completely abandon the liberal consensus and become propagandists against regulation, against unions. And I call them the boardroom Jacobins, because suddenly these nice, polite CEOs form these ad hoc coalitions to create these basically disinformation campaigns. And by the way, Sam, when I go on nice, polite radio shows, I don't put things so bluntly, but I think your listeners
can handle
it.
We can handle it,
right? Stuff like cartoons, stuff like fake editorials that they have, the Chamber of Commerce write or pretend that are kind of submissions from ordinary citizens. And this stuff is so successful that I quote a poll in 1978 that 2/3 of the country thinks that corporations are paying taxes that are too high. Right.
Yeah, that is.
So all this stuff is happening way before Ronald Reagan is even nominated.
So, all right. So I want to start with, I want to go back over these three different stools. And I also want to talk about that meeting that
I love the word stool, by the way, because it has that wonderful double meaning.
Exactly. I want to talk about that meeting with I think it was Falwell and some of those boardroom people. And how
not Falwell, but it was definitely Howard Phillips was there.
Phillips,
Richard Viguerie. Yeah.
So all right, but
it was at Richard Viguerie's house.
So okay, right. So all right. So getting back to the new right, this notion of organizing discontent is fascinating to me, because it all this was when these cultural aggrievements. Right. And this has been, it seems like this has been the story. I mean, I don't know. I guess to a certain extent, it's it goes back to the pre-Civil War, right? A certain amount of cultural aggrievement that drives this. And in many respects, this is just the latest iteration of that.
Absolutely true.
And they're organizing this discontent, and in some respects they're also driving it, I guess is a way.
That's right.
And but what,
considering the fact that that schools are actually not forcing children to accept homosexuality from their teachers, they are in fact driving it.
Right.
It's made up.
Right. And it's almost, it reminds me of like stuff like this is the war on Christmas. I mean, it seems like that's from a bygone era, but they would just go around and find like, hey, there was a school in Wisconsin that took the word, Jesus out of the song Silent Night. Yeah. And
there was a guy who actually burned a Bible in Boston Commons after the anti-gay rights crusade in Miami in a witch's costume. So that was a big one.
Right. I mean, these type of things, and then they get sort of blown out. So, but the people that they were appealing to, were they religious folks? I mean, and then there was this realization by guys like Phillips and Viguerie that we can go directly. We can go to they're sort of like their shepherds.
Jack right into the matrix. Yeah. We can jack right into the cortex, right? Skip the middleman and go to the preachers.
Right. I mean, were they trying to reach those same people, or were those people sort of adjacent?
Adjacent. Yeah. So, all these people who are like all the anti-gay rights initiatives that I write about in the ballot in 1977 and 1978, those were all started generally by preachers, right? So it's not like preachers were not part of the game, right? But then they realized that if they get the preachers as basically their precinct captains, right, which happens with the Reagan campaign, then they have this solid gold. And by the way, let me remind you of a story that's in chapter 1 of the book, in which Gerald Ford's pollster is having a strategy meeting for Gerald Ford's presidential campaign against Jimmy Carter, and he's going through all these statistics about how many Americans are calling themselves born again. And all of Ford's campaign consultants are kind of cracking all these jokes about how they should nominate Billy Graham instead or Oral Roberts. And the pollsters like, guys, stop joking. This is really serious stuff. These guys have the most powerful political machine in the history of America, right? So that's basically they're kind of cutting out the middleman. Exactly.
And then the irony, of course,
Jimmy Carter has it in 1976, but by 1980, Jimmy Carter was very much a traditional Southern Baptist in not trying to bring his religious values into his policy making and supports things like the ERA. He's completely considered a familiar of the devil by then.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So in some ways, at like in I guess stage one of liftoff, as it were, for the evangelical sort of politicization, that helps Jimmy Carter because they're like, oh, he's one of us.
Exactly.
But then they start to realize like, oh no, actually we're slightly different, or they get trained
They realize
to be
that
different.
Jimmy Carter is friends with Bob Dylan. And Jimmy Carter reads Reinhold Niebuhr, is not a fundamentalist. And, Jimmy Carter, is really big on the Equal Rights Amendment. And they're basically considering everything in life as completely a battle between good versus evil. And Jimmy Carter's on the wrong side of all these questions.
So I'm trying to like get a sense of how they move from, so they realize that like Goldwater's recipe is just like sort of dry policy that people, if they really, really sat down and thought about it, wouldn't like. And so
that's right.
And so we've got to make it more about like just channeling their anger and have them vote against things rather than sort of for things on some level.
Right.
And then it's like they expand the playing field. Like at one point, it felt like, 5 or 6 years ago that shrinking the deficit was just one more sort of cultural signifier that was like almost like gods and guns or, being anti-gay. It was like it was just another sort of box. And is that what basically the process that took place? I mean, is that how we got to let's talk about the anti-tax movement that sort of propelled, because in what started in California, the next place after Prop 13 was Proposition 3 in Massachusetts. And I was in high school at that time. And it was just like overnight, we lost half of everything in our high school. I mean, literally no sports, no art or anything like that.
Yes. That's another tributary. So I like the river, I like the metaphor of all these kind of tributaries feeding into a river, right? So another tributary is what they call the tax revolt. And, that story starts pretty much independently of all this stuff. That's a very specific, weird kind of genesis. And it has to do with talk about organizing discontent, one very specific discontent in one very specific place. And that place is California.
Yeah. And
basically California after World War II is a place that everyone is moving to for obvious reasons, right? It's the golden, it's America, only more so. It's the golden dream. And, GIs are moving there after World War II because they, went to training there and were like, oh my God, palm trees, I can get away from my annoying mother-in-law, whatever. And they're buying bungalows, for like $10,000, and the economy is booming. And one of the reasons, of course, the economy is booming and it's doing so well and it's creating the most dynamic economy basically in the world is because of all the liberal middle class building social programs that Governor Pat Brown is putting in place. Free college, opening campuses everywhere, freeways, water programs. So it's liberalism creating this massive middle class and creating this enormous wealth. And home prices, meanwhile, are skyrocketing. Are you there?
Yep.
So home prices are skyrocketing, and it's crazy. I mean, they're kind of doubling, every decade. So like, your $10,000 house that you buy in 1945 is worth like $100,000 in 1975, and there's no home equity loans. So if your house increases in value by 10 times, your property taxes increase 10 times.
Right.
So it's this very unfair system, and you don't get that money unless you sell the house, and you basically have to come up with this massive cash every year to pay your property taxes. So it's this big policy problem. And all these liberals are working out these really wonky, think tanky solutions how to solve this. But the Republicans won't pass them through the legislature, because if they do, then the current Democratic governor, who happens to be Jerry Brown, Pat Brown's son, will get the credit, and then he'll get reelected. And they want to elect a Republican governor. So they sabotage all the solutions to the problem, and that creates an opening for this absolutely lunatic, far-right populist poop stirrer. I know that you have FCC issues here, named Howard Jarvis, who, is this far-right gadfly in Los Angeles. He keeps on running for mayor and coming in like 10th place. One year his platform is getting rid of garbage collection because he doesn't believe in government. He's a guy who keeps on showing up at the Los Angeles City Council meeting. They turn off his microphone because he won't stop screaming at them. He manages to get on the ballot for the 1978 primary election, Proposition 13, which is this radical property tax fix that limits property taxes to 1% of value, but not only for homes, but also for businesses. So it's basically a giveaway to corporations. And it also has this part of it where if the legislature in Sacramento wants to raise any other tax, sales tax, income tax, whatever, they need a 2/3 supermajority. Yep. So it basically sabotages fiscal, public finance in California like forever. And by the way, there's a great irony to this. One of the reasons the effects of this aren't felt, and one of the reasons it spread to the rest of the country, because people are like, oh, look, it worked, California's doing just fine, was because there was a massive budget surplus at the time because of all the tax increases that Ronald Reagan signed when he was governor in the 60s. So that's a little irony right there. So basically, Proposition 13 passes, and a lot of that is racial, right? A lot of that is all this government is going to support Black people, and it's massively more popular among white people than Black people. And people will say things like, they would do polls like, if the government doesn't have enough money to pay for services because of Proposition 13, what kind of services should be cut? And 60% of people would say, oh, well, welfare, of course. And 1% of people would say, oh, well, if fire services maybe. Right. And of course, property taxes don't pay for welfare, but they do pay for fire services. So really, it's this massive con job that destroyed the glorious public education system of California, yet today. But it passes, and it's so successful that politicians all over the country, including liberal Democratic politicians, leap on the bandwagon. Howard Jarvis goes to Washington and visits the Senate, and I have a scene of all these Democratic senators basically groveling at his feet and saying, how can we do this, in our state? And, some people like George McGovern are like, guys, this is crazy. There's a liberal Republican, Ed Brooke from your own home state of Massachusetts. And He says, guys, Proposition 13 is not some magic word, but, the genie is out of the bottle. And of course, a big backer of Proposition 13 is this and all this principle of, limiting taxes generally is of course Ronald Reagan, and he gets an enormous political boost for this as he's beginning to create his organization for the presidency. So you have this coalition, anti-tax crusaders, which also include corporate America, which is of course paid all these propagandists to convince people that the reason the American economy is doing bad is because corporate taxes are so high. Complete snow job, of course. You have these terrified Christians who believe that Jimmy Carter is going to shut down their churches unless they, hire gay preachers. And you have these brilliant, cunning, vicious new right organizers who are weaponizing campaign finance law. They create this political action committee, the National Conservative Political Action Committee, even only in the middle of 1979, a year and a half before the election, comes out with these savage attack ads against all these great liberal senators who are running up re-election in 1980, like George McGovern and Birch Bayh and Frank Church, claiming that they're secret ultra liberals. And the guy who's the head of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, the youngest member of the New Right leadership cadre, says the great thing about this political action committee thing is that we can lie through our teeth in these ads, and the politician we support stays clean.
Right.
And to put a cherry on top, this particular guy whose name I can never remember in interviews because I've repressed it because he's so evil, he is secretly gay. All his comrades and colleagues in the New Right know he's gay, even though he's, helping lead this movement that's weaponizing anti-gay prejudice in order to get power for the plutocrats. And of course, he dies in the middle of the 1980s from AIDS.
Oh, geez.
So this is my happy little tale.
Well,
Buy the book.
And by secret ultra liberal, what they're saying is not they are for
giving you Social Security.
Right. They're not for it. It's not they're super socialist. It's that they're going to have gays, babysit your kids, and
well, they're also going to disarm us against the Soviet Union.
Right. So it's all these sort of like cultural touchstones that they're attacking them on, not on like economic policies necessarily.
Right. Although, and this is kind of the answer to your original question, they are kind of, through these issues like taxes, easing people into this small government ideology,
right,
which a lot of the preachers believed in anyway. Like Jerry Falwell, he
explain
was
this
like a libertarian.
Explain this, because the reason why it was not, I think like the popular impression is that abortion is what drove this evangelical move into this coalition with Viggory and these business leaders. But in fact, it was much more material for them.
Right. So one of the things that happens is there are all these Christian schools that all these preachers are starting basically to protect our dear little ones from things like, science. The teaching that the world was created in 6 days and the seventh day God rested.
And integration. And integration.
Well, so
right?
that's kind of a complicated story. So at the same time, after Brown versus Board of Education, all these Southern racists are.
Are you there, Rick? We seem to have lost him for a moment.
You dropped.
Oh, I did? Oh, gosh.
Preachers begin.
I'm sorry, Rick. I'm sorry. We just dropped for a second. So just get into that about the integration. Sorry.
Right. So basically, they're different, right? So a lot of these Christian schools are not segregationists, and a lot of these preachers are trying to recruit African Americans. But why would you want to go to, if you're Black, why would you want to go to one of these preachers' schools when this was the same guy who was, fighting against Brown versus Education 20 years ago? But basically, the IRS comes up with new regulations to make sure that no private schools are segregating. And every school, including, these Christian academies, have to prove either that they have, basically 5% of the population of African Americans in their community, or that they're at least, making some token efforts at minority recruitment. And if they don't, the IRS might investigate with, the remote possibility that they're going to lose their 501c3 tax exemption. And when that happens in 1978, all these preachers go ballistic. And that's when you get the kind of religious freedom arguments you get now from people like the Hobby Lobby, which is basically that the government has no business regulating my quote unquote church, meaning this school I've opened. So I have this example of there's a Christian school in Concord, New Hampshire in 1977. That's housed in this rickety building that is not up to code, and not up to the local building code. And the preacher is so apoplectic that the local government is going to insist that like the school is safe for these children to go in, that he gets fundamentalist preachers from all over the country to come to this rally in the town square. And he says he's willing to go to jail in order to fight, the imposition of Caesar, these kind of tax collecting, centurions from, his ministry. And that sort of energy is really what makes preachers en masse flock into this New Right project. This idea that they're going to kind of lose their tax exemptions because they're not going to, they refuse to do things like, fill out forms
right,
saying how many African American students they have.
Let's talk a little bit about the Democrats, because they
our friends the Democrats.
Well, yeah, I mean, on some level, like right, you write about Muskie and
right,
basically,
and how tough they are in fighting for regulation, and how willing they are to basically tell companies like General Motors to go to hell if they don't like it. Right.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Explain that story.
We want to see.
That story about Muskie and the cafe standards.
Right. My favorite. So Edmund Muskie is the tribune of the environmentalists in the Senate. And by the way, he's the guy that Richard Nixon sabotaged out of the race. And that was a big part of the Watergate scandal. But anyway, Edmund Muskie sponsors a bill to require car manufacturers to meet minimum mileage standards. They're called CAFE standards. They still exist. And the car manufacturers, some kind of truncating a bunch of different things, say, well, we don't have the technology to do that. We need to negotiate this. And Muskie says, I don't care. If you don't have the technology to keep America's air clean, you don't deserve to make your product. Right? I mean, imagine if the Democrats said it to Facebook or Amazon, if you can't control your platform, you don't deserve to have a platform. And at one point in the negotiations, one of the car industry lobbyists hands this guy named Leon Billings, who is the main aide for their environmental committee, a single sheet of paper that has their suggestions about how these negotiations can go forward. And Leon Billings folds the piece of paper into a paper airplane and sails it over their head.
I mean,
no negotiations.
But that dynamic of the Democrats saying, look, the people, broadly speaking, are not going to pay for your externalities, right? Like you cannot. Right. And at that time, there was a lot less hostility towards. They were a lot more defensive of, I think, labor at that time. You're not going to exploit labor. Right. You're not going to exploit our natural resources. The way that you calculate your profits have to include not offloading the costs to society. Right. What happened?
Yeah. What happened? Well, one of the things that happened, and I hate to say this to our dear old friend, is Jimmy Carter happened, right? I mean, he was a huge fan of deregulation. And I mean, the simplest way to put it, this is kind of how a Marxist would put it, was profits were falling, right? And again, that's what kind of mobilized the boardroom Jacobins. And everyone was kind of desperate. How was America going to reestablish this kind of economic power and strength that seemed to be ebbing away, week by week, month by month, year by year in this era of high inflation, high unemployment, slow growth, stagnating productivity. And this is kind of where the shock doctrine comes in. This is where you get the kind of Wall Street Journal editorial page and these kind of supply side quack economists who are basically saying, wow, everyone's desperately casting about for a solution. We'll put something on the table that's simple, easy to understand, and politicians will back because it's so simple and easy to understand and so easy to sell. And one of those ideas is that all this entire economic ordeal is being caused by deregulation, which was nonsense. I mean, environmental deregulation, just like people who talk about the Green New Deal point out, it was creating jobs. It wasn't destroying jobs, right? And then they were saying it was happening because of high corporate taxes. They called it a capital formation crisis, right? And I say as soon as they came up with that idea, you began to see it reverberating across the pages of the congressional record. You got people like Tom Bradley, the liberal Democrat mayor of Los Angeles, who was, testifying before Congress, having been recruited by, these lobbyists, saying, well, God, Los Angeles' economy and African-American unemployment is going through the roof because of the capital formation crisis, not because, external factors going on halfway around the world that we have no control over.
Speaking of the oil shocks and whatnot.
Right. And one of the problems with Jimmy Carter is that he considers, he believes in this incorrect theory that the reason we have so much inflation is that we have high deficits, which is one of the tragic ideas of all time, because of course now we have massive deficits and no inflation. Right. So it's completely incorrect. And, Stuart Eisenstadt was his chief policy advisor, and he just came out with a 1,000-page book about the Carter administration. And never once does he acknowledge this. He just says, oh, well, we tried to, balance the budget because, budget deficits were causing inflation. And so Jimmy Carter, whenever he would address the public about the economy, he would say that we need to sacrifice that the government has to do less, that we need to make do with less. And, when it came to energy, that was great. That was prophetic. But when it came to the economy, it was a tragic mistake. And it was a tragic political mistake, because who are you going to vote for? The guy who says the way to solve the economic crisis is by cutting everyone's taxes by 30%. That's what Ronald Reagan said. Or the guy who says we all need to tighten our belts.
I mean, that was the interesting sort of dynamic, is that usually, or at least theoretically, right, and you write about this, the Democrats are Santa Claus and the Republicans are the Grinch, or whatever it is. And Reagan was able to turn that on some level. And we should say that, like, there's a lot of things that are happening here in these preceding years. You've got the oil embargo, and then a second oil crisis. You've got we're off the gold standard at that point, and people don't really fully understand the implications of that, I think, in that decade, and probably for decades afterwards in some level, like in terms of our capacity to print money and have a deficit and not be the same problem. And it also sort of feels like Carter, there was something very moralistic about Carter. Like, some of the things that the notion of austerity was, maybe I'm projecting, but was like religious.
That was absolutely the grounding of his vision of society. And another part of the tragedy was he didn't really say that when he was running for president in 1976. He said, "I'm never going to lie to you," right? But here's this guy who kind of grows up on this farm in which they tan their own hides, and they render their own soap. And, he is, when he's like 10 years old, he begins walking a mile to 5 miles, I think, to town every morning to sell boiled peanuts, and raises enough money by the time he's in college that he's bought 3 houses as investment properties. So this idea of sacrificing in order to get ahead is absolutely central. And yes, it is religious. It's this kind of hard shell Baptist, we sit on hard wooden pews in, kind of unair conditioned, hard wooden churches. And, if you look at his speeches and what he's most remembered for, this is where his greatest passion resides, right? He had this quote that he loved to repeat over and over again. It was from Walter Lippmann from like 1940, speaking to his, Harvard graduating class at a reunion. He said, we've all enjoyed too much ease, and we need to sacrifice if we're going to, defeat this danger to civilization, and he was referring to Hitler, of course. But, Jimmy Carter would repeat this all the time, as if the American people wanted to live in a situation where they were acting as if they were at war.
War, right. All right. So lastly, let's just touch on this quickly, because on some level, this is the race between Reagan and Carter, I think, really speaks to, maybe in some respects, I mean, it's not exactly analogous, but there's a similar element between, maybe the 2016 election in terms of the way that the Democrats viewed Reagan, and the idea of nobody seemed to like either one of these candidates that much. And it was just who was least disliked won.
Yeah, it's I think there's a statistic 80% of people voted for Reagan because they quote unquote wanted to change. Nothing ideological.
Right. Well, talk about lastly the debate, because that that's
a parable about Democratic overconfidence.
Yeah.
And basically the entire Carter reelection strategy was based on proving to the electorate that Jimmy Carter was smarter than Ronald Reagan. Of course, when it comes to election, the person who wins the election is the person who's smarter, you might say. But they decided that if they could just get Jimmy Carter on the stage with Ronald Reagan in a debate, and they negotiated enough time for Jimmy Carter to point out all of Ronald Reagan's, mistakes and lies, that the scales would fall from the public's eyes and Jimmy Carter would win. And going into the debate, it was just about tied in all the polls. And Jimmy Carter executed on his strategy flawlessly. He pointed out that that Ronald Reagan had questioned Social Security, and Ronald Reagan made a lie in response. And then Jimmy Carter then, a couple minutes later, pointed out that Ronald Reagan had started his political career in 1961 lobbying against Medicare. And of course, you probably have played the album where Ronald Reagan says, as quoted by Eric Trump, by the way, in his convention speech, that if Medicare passes, although Eric Trump didn't mention that this was a reference to Medicare, that Americans will be telling their children stories about what the nation was like when it was free.
Yep.
And Ronald Reagan responded, "There you go again." And when he said that, the audience laughed because it was a real good one-liner. And backstage, the Carter people all gave each other high fives because he had fallen into their trap, and they just presumed that the headlines the next morning would be Ronald Reagan lies about his record. Instead, the headlines were Ronald Reagan convinces the public he's a charming, decent guy. And Ronald Reagan wins in a landslide.
And that there you go again.
So
that there you go again referred to the idea that, you know, you're mean, you're a school marm, you're distorting
my record.
Right.
Even though he was absolutely not distorting his record, he was telling a bald-faced truth.
And then, well, I guess all of this has been history on some level. And
we shall overcome.
Yes. Well, I mean, and do you think that, lastly, let's just end on this, the media's inability to sort of like, and it's a very different media landscape in many respects, I think, now than even was like 10 years ago. But I feel like 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, the media was much similar to the way it was in 1980 than it is today, right? Like, you know, that social media and the ability for other sort of voices to hit on the same platform, if you will, has changed things a bit. But the media had no ability to deal. They called Reagan Teflon, and part of it was because of that, you know, of instances like that debate on some level.
Yeah. It was the ideology of balance, and I'm very proud of my ability to kind of come up with an account from that campaign of, you know, basically how that all locked into place, and show that the Reagan campaign had a specific strategy that was revealed in documents to work the refs and get them to start calling Jimmy Carter mean. That Jimmy Carter used to be a nice guy, but now he was a mean guy. And I show that kind of working and worming its way into the media's mindset week by week, as they try and get a handle on anything that they can do to criticize Jimmy Carter, so they can balance the idea that they must be tough on Ronald Reagan because they're liberal and the media is liberal, which is, you know, nonsense. They bend over backwards to be nice to Ronald Reagan. The New York Times never criticized Ronald Reagan for his lie about Social Security, but they did run 50 articles about this made up scandal called Billygate, which was kind of the butthurt emails of 1980.
I mean, really, Obama was the first president to run as a Democrat, I think, in at least my lifetime, who was not subjected to that. And Biden seems to get some of that as well, where it's like they're in some ways immune from criticism.
Yeah, and that's the kind of media environment all Democrats have to negotiate. And of course, all Democrats, every Democrat runs as kind of a budget hawk because they still have to somehow disprove this non-fact that Democrats are fiscally irresponsible, and they never get credit from it. I mean, I have a quote from a Democratic pollster in 1978, basically saying, when you read about the Democratic Party, you still get the same New Deal cliches. No one's even reporting the fact that, you know, Jimmy Carter has completely made a hard right turn away from this whole ideology.
And that's been problematic, I think, for those of us who want the Democrats to be more left, is that it took a long time for people to realize that they had moved so far right.
That's exactly right.
Rick,
right as usual, Sam.
Rick Perlstein, let me just thank you for all four of these books.
How funny the book is, because it sounds so dark and scary.
Well, you know, no, it's not. I mean, like one thing that struck me was like about Superman. Because I just rewatched that with my son, and I was like, this seems like the most 80s movie ever. But it was actually in the late 70s, which I guess sort of on some level proves the point on some level. We were that's where we were headed. Superman.
Right. I'll end by quoting Steve Bannon. Politics is downstream from culture.
Isn't that Breitbart? Didn't Breitbart start that?
Did Breitbart say that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
I think he said
people
it.
were willing to vote at the box office for Ronald Reagan before they were willing to vote for Reagan at the ballot box.
Yeah. Well, Rick, thank you so much for these works. I mean, thanks for coming on, but also thank you for writing these books. I mentioned to you before you came on that I'm going to try and get my daughter to read these. You know, she's going to be remote schooling, and I just to get her on. You know, I feel like just reading these 4 books would be a massive achievement for a kid her age, and an understanding of just sort of like, you know, this moment, because
yeah, and the amazing thing is Sam's daughter is only 6 years old.
And she's well, it's going to take her a while. I think she'll probably be done with this by her teens. But Rick Perlstein, the book is Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. We will put a link at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam.